let me tell you that it's a totally different orchestra. It is now from 1806 for the Beethoven to 1940 for the Rachmaninoff. And there's a huge change of every single dimension, and you've got the romantic orchestra in its fullness. He wrote in this piece a concerto for orchestra. If you think of it that way, we just played the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra last concert. This is the Concerto for Orchestra by Rachmaninoff. It shows off every aspect of the orchestra and its possibility. He was living in America, living in Hollywood, and with a deep nostalgia for Russia. And you can hear it in every bar of this music, his love of Russia and his feeling isolated from Russia, but he threw himself into life in America fully. The orchestration is dazzling, I mean absolutely dazzling. If you listen carefully to the orchestration of this piece, you don't need to have a thought in your head except just taking in what this orchestra can do. He wrote it for the Philadelphia Orchestra, which at the time was the epitome of what an orchestra could be, known all over the world for the Philadelphia sound and the virtuosity. And he exploited it to the absolute limit. You are going to get to know all the solo players in this orchestra, in this performance. Which, interesting enough, in the Bartók you didn't, because in the Bartók it's more about group. Here it's about solos. There are 3 dances. They were conceived as dances. He hoped that they would be choreographed by Fokin, who was his friend, but unfortunately he never got around to it. So there, it's a concert piece. It's very, very simple. Each of the movements has a first section, a contrasting section, and back to the first section. So there's no sonata form to follow or anything intellectual. It's very, very interesting, very easy to listen to. It's beautiful. First movement is a brilliant march, and it has a marcato feeling. And that's the main theme, like that, just a falling arpeggio in every instrument, English horn, clarinet, bassoon, bass clarinet. The question is, how fast should it be played? And there's a lot of controversy about it. Some are very fast. Ashkenazy, who's a great Russian musician, plays it very fast. Some people play it much slower. I am very happy to report that I play it at the right tempo. And it needs a little explanation. Last year, there was a discovery made, unknown to anybody, that Rachmaninoff had gone to the home of Ormandy on Long Island to show him how he wanted the piece to go before he conducted it. And somebody, we don't know who, put a microphone in the next room and recorded that session. And it's just been brought to light, and I have listened to it. And it's fascinating. Here's Ormandy sitting at the piano, playing this piece, and he plays all the tempi just right. Not surprisingly, because he composed the piece. So what you're going to hear is as close as we can get to his interpretation of it. And one of the things that he does on this performance is enormous freedom of timing, so much freedom that it's virtually impossible to imagine an orchestra doing it. But you'll get pretty close this afternoon. We're doing a huge amount of what I call rubato. That's the freedom of timing. And the most dramatic thing that happens incidentally, his marking for the movement is non allegro, which doesn't help at all. So people have no idea how to interpret that. But now we have evidence of exactly what he wanted, and that's what you're going to hear. The second theme, or the contrasting theme, introduces a most gorgeous moment, which you will never forget, which is the sound of a saxophone. And we have a great saxophone player. I've never heard one better, maybe not as good, playing this beautiful theme. And you remember I told you that the first theme is, well, the saxophone theme is, it's just the same theme upside down. It's a beautiful Russian song. I mean, he composed it, but it's like a Russian folk song, and it's full of nostalgia and deep feeling, and it's like a loving embrace. It's an extraordinary thing. It's a very short moment, but it's unforgettable. You will not forget it. And then it comes in the strings, and always the accompaniment is very, very, very free. I think he would have been very happy with the way we're playing it, because it's very close to what he did. And then it goes back to the A section, back to the dance, the dramatic dance. Then it winds down, and just before the end, there's something very touching, which is a very beautiful theme, which you'll hear on the strings. And I don't need to play it because it's very memorable. But what is interesting for you to know is that it was a theme from his first symphony. And his first symphony was a catastrophic failure. I mean, really monumental failure. It was so badly received that he tore up the score and went into a massive depression. And it took years for him to come out of that depression. And it's very touching to me that in his very last piece, he went back to that moment in his life when he had that terrible failure and brings this theme forward. I find that very, very moving. I think you will too. It's as if he's come to terms with his whole life at that point, at the end. Interesting enough, no one would have recognized that theme at that time because the score had been torn up and had never been heard. Now it's come to light and we've heard it, and so we can recognize it. The second movement is a waltz movement. It starts with a snarling figure in muted brass, which suggests an alarm, something very terrible. It's not a simple waltz. It has a very dark side. Everything in Russia has a dark side. And, but he's taken the Viennese waltz and made a whole piece, a seductive waltz. And I said to the orchestra the other day, it should sound like purple brushed velvet. And we're doing pretty well in that department, with lots and lots and lots of rubato. We can't copy what Rachmaninoff did, but we can be influenced by it. And it's a piece of tremendous elan. It's in the style of Kreisler's violin playing. Kreisler was a close friend, lived down the road, and he brought him in to provide the bowings. So the bowings you're going to see are Kreisler's bowings. It's kind of nice to think down the road. The third movement is a brilliant piece of theatrical virtuosity. And it's full of syncopated rhythms, very jazzy and enormously effective. It begins with a cry of sorrow, quite tormented in the strings, and it's always with this interval. The falling third, you'll hear that at the beginning, and with harmonies that are very, very sad. And then comes this wild dance macabre with percussion and all sorts of things. And then comes a bass clarinet solo, which is the sign that a very long middle section is going to start, a slow section, which represents, I think, the glowing embers of memory of his youth in Russia. And it's deeply Russian music. And full of those cries of pain. And the word lamentoso appears often in the score, more often than necessary. He'd write lamentoso every now and again. And then he goes back to the dance macabre, and now a new moment, a new element comes in. This is very exciting. You get this. Those are the only 4 notes that you get. But if you know your Gregorian chant, and you know Rachmaninoff, and you know Liszt, and you know the Symphonie Fantastique, you know that's the Dies Irae. That is a Gregorian chant which was pervasive in Western music because it represented death. And here's the interesting thing. Everybody in the audience would not only know it, recognize it, but they would feel fear when they heard it, because it represented death. And so that comes in on the trumpet, very simple, first time, B, D, D, D. And if you can at that moment recreate that sense of anxiety and fear that would have been pervasive around the entire piece, you will have recreated something very special. And this death theme was very important to him, and notice that the titles that he gave to each movement were noon, twilight, and midnight originally. Then he left them out. Notice there's no dawn there, no birth. This is all about old age and death. And he said about this piece, it must have been my last spark. And it indeed was. He did not compose any more after this piece. The last sound you hear is the last sound that Rachmaninoff composed. So death is pervasive. But there's a very interesting other element, which is that at the same time, there's another Gregorian chant which is being used, which is a quotation from another piece of his own, from the early days, which is called the Resurrection Hymn from his chorale Vespers, his piece Vespers. It doesn't matter, you don't need to know it, but it's prominently played, and over that moment in the score, he writes one word, Alleluia. All right. So he's a deeply religious person, and he's bringing these two forces of life and death together at the end of this piece in a very, very moving and impressive way. And the theme of life emerges triumphant with that word, Alleluia, over the score. And then finally, you get the full Dies Irae in the most terrifying form. That's the whole Dies Irae theme. And if you remember, that falling third, which we heard at the beginning of the movement, you'll hear it over and over, that's a premonition of death that is going to pervade the whole last section. So he did not say that he wanted a program for this piece. He said, let people feel whatever they feel and think whatever they think. But it's true that there is an underlying story, if you like. For him, last piece, he knew it was the last piece. He lived another 3 years after he wrote it, as did Bartók. You remember from last year, last concert I told you, he rose from his deathbed and wrote the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra and then lived on 3 years, but he didn't compose anymore. And that's true of him as well. There's one last thing I want to tell you about. The very last note, the end, is incredibly dramatic and loud. It will be as much as this building can stand before it starts peeling. And the end, the very last note, is very controversial because nobody knows how long the note is in the tam-tam. Everybody else has a short note, eighth note, finished. The tam-tam is not an eighth note, it's a dotted quarter, which is of course longer, and has the words laissez vibrer, let it vibrate. And most conductors ignore it and just have a cut-off just like everybody else because it sounds so odd to have one instrument go on. Some people just have it go on a little bit. I take him literally. I say, let it vibrate, and you'll hear it vibrate, and you'll be prevented from clapping. So please let it vibrate and see how long it is, and you'll have your own opinion about. Nobody knows, because unfortunately that bit wasn't on the recording with the piano, so we never exactly. My reaction precisely. Shit. But anyway, I have to tell you, this has been an amazing experience. Most of the orchestra players didn't particularly like the Rachmaninoff. Some of them demeaned it by calling it film music. And gradually, as we've worked on it, they've had greater and greater respect. And now there isn't one person on this stage who doesn't think this is an absolute masterpiece. And in its own idiom, in its own environment, it's as great a piece as the Beethoven Violin Concerto, can certainly stand with it on a program.